My name is Stephanie Hartung. I'm a professor at Northeastern Law School, and I serve on the board of the New England Innocence Project. I'm also a longtime Needham resident. I'm here today with Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights, and I'll be speaking with Lauren about recent developments in the Needham case involving the wrongful arrest of Marvin Henry. As you may recall, in July of 2021, Mr. Marvin Henry, an employee at Massage Envy in Needham, sued the town of Needham along with individual members of the police department in federal court. And the lawsuit raised a series of civil rights violations under a federal statute called Section 1983. The claims are based on a January 25th, 2020 incident where Mr. Henry alleges that he was wrongly detained and arrested outside Starbucks in Needham. Mr. Henry was handcuffed for 30 minutes on suspicion of shoplifting, although he did not match the description of the alleged shoplifter, aside from his race and gender, and although he possessed a receipt showing proof of all purchases. In addition to false arrest, the lawsuit also alleges that Mr. Henry was subjected to unlawful search and excessive force at the hands of the named officers. Notably, the complaint also alleges racial bias at the hands of the officers and points to a history of biased policing, race-based policing in Needham. On September 19th of this year, 2021, the town of Needham filed an answer to Mr. Henry's complaint in the lawsuit. We hope that Needham residents will take the time to read through the answer to better understand the town's response. And after reviewing the complaint and answer, a couple of things stuck out to me in terms of the town's approach. First, I think it's notable that the town repeatedly raises allegations of procedural violations on behalf of Mr. Henry and his lawyers in the complaint. They cite to their approach in misnumbering and misuse of headings and claim that those things were improper in the complaint. This approach seems to suggest that the plaintiff's lawyers failed to follow procedural rules, which really isn't accurate and also tends, I think, to take away the emphasis on the substance of the complaint. The other issue that I noticed is that when the town's answer does get to the substance of the complaint, virtually all of the allegations are outright denied, or there's a response of no knowledge to a particular fact. And both of these approaches are somewhat surprising at times. For example, the town's answer outright denies that Mr. Henry has experienced pain and suffering following his arrest. And this strikes me as an unsupported, untenable position, given their lack of knowledge or ability to have knowledge of his personal well-being or experiences since the incident. The town also claims to have no knowledge of some facts that are very clearly publicly available. For example, they claim to have no knowledge of what the actual suspected shoplifter was wearing or what he looked like, even though photos of that individual were both included in the Tidwell report and have actually been published in the Needham Times. So it's surprising that they deny knowledge of that type of fact. So Lauren, can you talk a little bit about your reaction to the town's answer to Mr. Henry's complaint?
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to speak about this incredibly important case. A couple of responsive thoughts on the answer. First, we are glad to see that the town did admit several facts that we've known to be true for a long time, that are confirmed, of course, by the Tidwell report and even by the internal investigations report. For example, that Mr. Henry did not resist at any time, that he offered to show his receipt, that he was not read his Miranda rights, that he was immediately handcuffed, and that, of course, nothing was actually stolen from CVS that day. Those acknowledgements are, of course, long overdue, given that the initial response when we sent our demand letter last summer was for the town to publish a report to its website that falsely portrayed Mr. Henry as a multiple-time shoplifter of that CVS, when in fact nothing of the kind had occurred. The other things we noted in the answer, some of which you've already touched on, include ways in which the town continues to push back on the idea that any real harm has befallen Mr. Henry. As you say, denying that he experienced reputational, dignitary, or emotional harm for the incident, denying the physical pain and embarrassment caused by being handcuffed in such a public way near his place of work, and denying the improprieties in police procedure that occurred both during and after his detention. For example, the town acknowledges that the officers were not instructed to complete an incident report, but also simply says that Officer McMahon continued to update her report with information she learned over the course of the investigation. Even though, as anyone who has seen the video footage from the previous year's CVS alleged shoplifting can tell you, it is clear immediately that Mr. Henry is not the person portrayed in those videos, and that it should not have taken multiple updates for that to be revealed. Another example is that we see the town sort of prevaricating around the idea that they tried to fabricate a false theory of Mr. Henry's criminality, believing that he was taking money from his employer and using that to purchase products, which he then pocketed, something that the Tidwell report revealed. And though we see some acknowledgement of that, some admission in the answer, we do not see the full-throated acknowledgement that officers seem to have gone out of their way to concoct an idea of criminality that would enable them to continue pursuing Mr. Henry as a suspect, even though, as has now been demonstrated in multiple forums, Mr. Henry was entirely innocent of any and all wrongdoing and has never stolen anything from any of the CVS stores.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about how Mr. Henry is doing since the complaint was initially filed?
Sure. So Mr. Henry, as you can imagine, has faced a lot of attention over this. And he is by nature a private man, a family man, someone who cares deeply about his sons, his wife, going to church, his work, his family, his friends. And I think this whole process has really shaken him. In particular, he was really troubled when the Tidwell report was published, and he was able to see the lengths that these officers had gone to again, concoct this false theory of criminality and to suspect that he had been stealing from his employer. And to now see that in the public light was, of course, really disturbing. And to feel that even after the internal affairs and the independent investigation, that there was going to be no justice really disheartened him. Mr. Henry is understandably nervous about the process of being involved in a lawsuit, but he is also optimistic and courageous, knowing that if we can get even a small kind of a systemic reform in the Needham Police Department to mean that this doesn't have to happen to any other resident or visitor of color, it will have meant that he's done something really important, something that he can be really proud of, and something that he can pass and share along with his sons, 4 young Black men of color who he, of course, hopes never have to go through anything like this.
Great, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do with Lawyers for Civil Rights, what the organization's mission is, and how it was that you became focused on Mr. Henry's case?
Absolutely. So Lawyers for Civil Rights is a racial justice and immigrants' rights impact litigation nonprofit. We're headquartered in Boston, but our work spreads across the Commonwealth and, of course, across the country. We practice in several different impact areas, including police accountability, education, housing, voting rights, and race and climate justice. We were founded over 50 years ago at the request of President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, who were looking for lawyers who would uphold the Constitution and push forward the civil rights movement. And Lawyers for Civil Rights has answered that call, stemming from their work to desegregate the Boston public schools to our recent victories against the Trump administration and their efforts to harm immigrants, people of color, and those who are most vulnerable. We became acquainted with Mr. Henry's case through connections with other activists working with downtown progressives, Progressives West Roxbury, and Progressive Needham. We were really desirous of helping Mr. Henry for a couple different reasons. First, we were incredibly compelled by the story, the personal experience of someone who had gone through this horrific encounter in January and didn't have the sense that he could speak about this publicly, felt really isolated, felt as if this must be his fault in some way, felt as if what had happened to him was really shameful, and it was just something he had to bear by himself. I was very moved by that. The second is, of course, that we seem to see, not just in Needham, but across the country, the idea that if a police encounter doesn't rise to the level of a of a death or of a conviction, that you don't really need to take any action. There is essentially a no harm, no foul attitude. But this is just part of the cost of being Black in America, is sometimes you're going to be profiled or stopped or handcuffed, and you just have to bear it, because unless someone really mortally injures you, you don't really have any recourse. And we wanted to change that narrative. People like Mr. Henry don't deserve to have their dignity robbed of them in full daylight. And so even in those cases where there isn't the kind of grievous bodily harm or death that you sometimes see in those incidents that populate the news, it is still absolutely worth standing up and saying that this is not right. This shouldn't happen to any citizen, and that reforms must happen in order to ensure we have fair, impartial, and just policing in our communities.
So there has been a lot of talk about police reform in the last year. Where do you think, as a civil rights lawyer, where do you think we are on the issue of racial equity and policing in the United States now that we're more than a year out of the murder of George Floyd?
Of course, the murder of George Floyd feels like an absolute sea change in this landscape, in part because it brought to the forefront what activists and communities of color have known for years, that there is a disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system at every level, ranging from arrests to charges to convictions to sentencing for communities of color, immigrant communities, and low-income communities. And we are incredibly happy to see that attention is being paid to that. And we are optimistic about what that might mean for the future. For example, we are following with great interest the progression of Massachusetts criminal reform bill, which aims hopefully to reduce some of these disparities in the criminal justice system, including in things like collateral consequences, which so many folks, I think, prior to the murder of George Floyd didn't even think about. The idea that even after you've served your time and paid all your dues, that a criminal record might still prevent you from achieving real opportunity in things like employment, education, or housing. We are also really gratified to see real attention being paid to right-sizing police budgets, such that police might not have to be involved in areas where they're not needed. For example, in policing children in schools, or in providing primary outreach for folks who are homeless or who are struggling with addiction or mental illness. And I think finally, it's incredibly important to see the widespread activism and attention that racial justice is getting. That this is a moment where we recognize that it's okay to talk about systemic and structural racism. You don't need to call any one person a racist. We need to recognize that our institutions are riven with the kind of biases that lead to incidents like the one that plagued Marvin Henry. And that if we work collectively, honestly, and passionately about solutions, we can together really create a better and more just society. Now, I'm not a policymaker, I'm just an attorney. I'm certainly not there to tell the town of Needham what of its many sort of available options it should pursue. What I am there to do is identify when the law has been violated. And certainly in Mr. Henry's case, the law was violated. And we believe this should not be regarded as a challenge to the town, but rather as an opportunity to listen to the story of someone who works there, someone that contributes to the town, and to hear about what can be done in the future to ensure that others don't have his same experience, such that the town can really be a welcoming place for everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.